Sarah's a marine phycologist with specific expertise in edible seaweeds. Sarah's interest in seaweed began during her undergraduate career at the University of Aberystwyth, Wales, and she later completed a PhD in marine botany at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. Sarah's academic research focus encompasses many facets of marine biology: marine macroalgal ecology, biology and taxonomy, microbiology, and molecular biology. But since joining CyberColloids, focus has become commercially orientated. The primary focus is still on marine macroalgae, but with a strong emphasis on developing novel processing methodologies and finding novel or value-added uses for edible seaweeds. So that sounds fascinating. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Sarah.
Thank you.
As a member of Coastwise, over to you.
Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so it's been a while actually since I've spoken to to Coastwise about the seaweed industry. So I thought I'd take the opportunity this morning to give you a general overview of where the industry is heading and introduce you to some of the concepts and sort of hot topics, some of the drivers that are pushing the industry forward. And in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of effort, a lot of interest in research into the potential uses of seaweed, the value of seaweed. And as a consequence, the European seaweed industry is set to expand quite massively in the next few years. Now, there's a sort of unified vision for Europe, really, for the development of a seaweed bioeconomy, or a blue bioeconomy based on seaweed, and the development of that in the coming years is going to be based on rapid upscaling of seaweed aquaculture, and seaweed biorefineries are going to play a key role in the development of this bioeconomy going forward. So what I'd like to do today is just talk to you a little bit about why we're interested in seaweed. What is it in seaweed that has value? Talk about the supply chain, because that's very important. If we're going to invest in a seaweed bioeconomy, where is all of this seaweed going to come from? We'll talk a bit about a potential biorefinery setup, and then at the end, just have a look at the future and can we actually give something back? I mean, instead of this being an exploitative industry, can we actually give something back? Can we restore some of the ecosystems or restore the ocean in some way? So I better start really with a definition. So what is a biorefinery? Well, essentially, it's a facility that converts biomass or organic matter into a variety of different end products, which can then be used as food or feed, as chemicals, different biomaterials, and even as fuel. Now, the main focus is using on multiple technologies and to deliver multiple products. So it can either be a sort of cascading approach or some kind of integrated approach, but the aim is to maximize all of the seaweed, use all of the biomass, not to have any waste streams, and not to generate any unnecessary effluents or emissions. And the focus is on using sustainable and resource efficient processing. And resource efficient processing means limiting the amount of energy that you use, limiting the amount of water that you use to process your seaweed. Now, seaweed biorefineries, or indeed algal biorefineries, because microalgae are also a focus for developing biorefinery type industries, and they are known as 3G or third generation biorefineries. Just a little bit of history. You may or may not be aware that originally, when the biorefinery concept was sort of put together, the focus was on the conversion of crops such as sugar beet and starchy crops, sugar cane as well, and the conversion of the sugar and the starch in those biomass streams to energy. And as you're probably all well aware, there's a lot of controversy over this approach because you're taking up valuable land space, taking up land space where agriculture and food production could be occurring. So second generation refineries took the approach of focusing on waste materials. So you know that most plant biomass it's got lignin in it, it's got cellulose in it. And these are two components that are quite difficult to break down during normal processing. So to use waste streams such as straw and hay and the sort of plant residue that was left from crops, that was the focus of the second sort of generation biorefineries. But again, the end point was focusing on production of biofuels. So macroalgal biorefineries or seaweed biorefineries are a little different in that they're dealing with a totally different biomass. Now, seaweed does contain some cellulose, but it doesn't contain any lignin. And we'll have a look in a minute at the different carbohydrate substrates that are present in seaweed for breakdown. Now, the focus of seaweed biorefineries can be on the production of biofuel, but also on a whole raft of other end products. Oh, what's happening? There we go. So I guess I ought to talk a little bit about the blue bioeconomy as well. So by definition, a bioeconomy is an economy that is based on the production, processing, and sustainable use of renewable biological resources. And obviously the blue refers to the, relates to the marine environment in this case. But with most roadmaps for the development of some sort of new bioeconomy, then we have to consider not just the environmental impact, but the economic impacts and also the social impacts. So the aim of a blue bioeconomy is actually to promote innovative, resource efficient and competitive economy. Also to address the social impacts such as the provision of food or services. And as we all know, we've got a growing population that needs to be fed. And the issue of nutrition security is fairly high on the agenda for most new economy. And nutrition security is not just about growing more food, but it's about providing nutritionally relevant food. So there's a lot of food around the planet, but whether it's actually nutritionally relevant and people are getting enough nutrition to survive is the question. And obviously in a bioeconomy, then we're looking at optimizing the use of resources so that we maximize the use of those resources, minimize the waste, and don't put any more environmental pressures on the planet. So why the interest in seaweed? So what is in seaweed that we're interested in? Well, I'm going to focus this talk on brown seaweeds today, in particular species of kelp, and you probably all recognise these as sugar kelp, Atlantic wakame and oarweed. These really are the three go-to species now for aquaculture in Europe. And if you remember back to the definition of a biorefinery must be based on renewable resources, sustainable resources. And for this reason, we're particularly focusing on the cultivation of seaweed. Now, there are a lot of biorefinery models around that focus on other seaweeds, in particular green seaweeds, ulva. But as Kat Oliver is going to be talking to us in a few weeks about ulva, I decided not to focus on that. So this table just gives a little bit of information on what we would typically see what we typically find in brown seaweeds that are of interest. And the values here are presented as percentage dry weight. You'll notice that there's a range and that the ranges of values in each of these columns is actually quite extensive. And that's because many of these components vary significantly between plants, between seasons, between locations. And that's one of the important factors in thinking about biorefining, because if you're going to be, for example, extracting mannitol, which is in the first box of this table, then you could have anything from 2 to 58%, and that makes a huge difference in your economic model. So the first 5 rows here are all carbohydrate type substrates that you would find in brown seaweeds. Cellulose you're probably familiar with, but the rest are particular to brown seaweeds. And you can see that in some instances, for example, mannitol might be almost 60% of the dry weight content of saccharina at some time during the year. Things such as alginate can be in the range of 30 to 45%. Seaweeds are also very rich in minerals, and again, this can be a third or even 40% of the dry weight of the biomass. Brown seaweeds are relatively high in protein, maybe up to about 20% protein, but they're all very low in fat. So let's focus on mannitol and laminarin to start with. And I've just included this photo here on the left because It's a cross section through the stipe of a brown kelp. And if you remember back to your seaweed workshop, seaweed identified workshops, then you should be able to tell me that this is a section through Laminaria hyperborea, because it's circular and it's got a rough edge with epiphytes growing on it. But if you look closely in the middle, you can see that there are the sort of like concentric rings, and in the zone in the middle of sort of dark, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but a dark zone in the middle. And that's because the stipe of these brown seaweeds contains sieve tubes. And basically, solutes are transported up and down the stipe. And mannitol and laminarin are actually storage polysaccharides. And they're transported up and down the stipe of the plant to the part of the plant where they're needed. If you look at this graph here, it's a very stylized graph that I've put together. It's based on average data for a number of European kelp species, but it shows how mannitol in green and laminarin in blue, how the content of those two carbohydrates builds up through the year. So from January, February time in the winter, it's fairly low for laminarin, a bit higher for mannitol, and it increases through the summer. So as the seaweeds have got access to nutrients and increased sunlight, they increase the mannitol and laminarin in their tissues. This red box here it's important because this is basically the time where aquacultured seaweed would be harvested. So somewhere between June and maybe September, depending on where in Europe we are. And you can see that this actually corresponds to the highest levels of mannitol and laminarin in the seaweed, which is great. That's what we want. Now, I've mentioned mannitol and laminarin because they are important in the generation of biofuels, and biofuels is a potential market or potential end use for seaweed. It's quite a controversial area, and I know that you're probably aware there's been a lot of discussion about whether biofuels are actually an effective or useful use of biomass. I think the main issue with growing seaweed is that for use in biomass is that you can actually offset a lot of the carbon, if not all of the carbon, through the process of growing the seaweed and actually processing the seaweed. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on. And even though biofuels that are derived from seaweed biomass still generate carbon dioxide when they're burnt, because they've got a carbon neutral process and supply chain, then actually they're doing the planet a lot of good. Now, I'm not an expert in the production of biofuels, but essentially what you need to do is to break the seaweed biomass right down to its smallest components, break it down to its sugars, and that might be using chemical methods or physical methods. Quite often it's using microbes, bacteria or fungi. And then you use, or even enzymes, and then you use microorganisms to either ferment that biomass or to digest it. If it's in the presence of oxygen, it's normally fermentation. If there's no oxygen present, then it's normally anaerobic digestion. And at the end of that process, you end up with bioethanol or biogas, methane, that sort of thing. And where the interest in biofuels with seaweed is heading at the moment is in the production of E10 fuels. And I'm not sure if you're aware that many of the green fuels that we're burning now are actually known as E5 fuels, and they are 95% petrol, 5% ethanol. With the seaweed bioethanol, the plan is to produce more E10 fuels, so they contain 10% ethanol and 90% of other fuels, petrol. And I've just included a link here at the bottom, and I can send this to you if you're interested. But there was a European project that's recently just finished, I think, called Macrofuels, and they're actually producing biofuel. And if you go onto the website, you can see a little video of a car that's being fueled using E10 fuel based on seaweed. And I think also it's important to consider that in the short term, hopefully we're going to be shifting towards the use of more electric powered vehicles, but electrifying some of the transport vehicles such as planes, ships, all of these sorts of transport use heavy fuels. And if the plan is to use biofuels from seaweed to substitute some of the percentage of that fuel, so maybe we can increase the percent from E10 up to, I don't know, E20, 25, something like that. Briefly want to mention fucoidan. Fucoidan is a structural carbohydrate, so you find it actually in the matrix of the seaweed. It's also a generic term, really, because there are lots of fucoidans in different species of seaweed. Now, they're fucose containing polysaccharides, and they're sulfated, and every kind of seaweed has its own, brown seaweed has its own kind of fucoidan. And because there are so many of them, then fucoidans have been shown to have many different bioactive properties. Now, the Japanese are very well aware of this, and they've been utilizing fucoidan for many years. And the photo here is just of a little shot bottle. It's sort of about this big of fucoidan. And Japanese would have one of these with their breakfast every morning. And you can actually buy them in vending machines on the street. The Japanese also put fucoidan into their food products. So when you look on the ingredients label on the back of a yogurt or a noodle dish, you will actually see fucoidan listed in the ingredients there. And that's because they understand and accept the potential health benefits of fucoidan. So we know that fucoidans from European species have anti-inflammatory properties. They have antioxidant properties. They can be used to modulate the immune system, so they're very good for your immune system. And they also have antiviral properties. So I've included this here just because it's topical, because right at the beginning of lockdown last year, there was some interesting research coming out looking at the potential to use fucoidan to block the COVID virus in cells. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you go out and take fucoidan to give you some immunity against COVID. That's not why I'm suggesting this, but there's just an interesting mechanism where sulfated polysaccharides from seaweed can actually block the virus from attaching to the cells in your respiratory tract, and also from penetrating, and then they get into the cell and do the nasty business. And there are actually some products in the market where sulfated polysaccharides from red seaweeds are used in nasal sprays, and you squirt them up your nose, and that gives you some defense against things like flu and cold viruses. So yeah, so don't go sniffing seaweed extracts, and don't go supplementing with fucoidan. I just wanted to give this as an illustration, really, of how the industry is moving with the times. So moving on to alginate and cellulose. In most biorefinery type models, you're going to end up with a sort of solid residue at the end of your processing, and this will mostly comprise alginate and cellulose. And the photograph that I'm showing there is actually some alginate that we extracted from Ilaria in the lab, and that was done as part of a small-scale biorefinery at CyberColloids. Now, alginate has been or is extracted from brown seaweeds on a global basis. It's a major global industry. But in terms of biorefinery concept, it might not necessarily be a product that you would focus on in terms of extracting it as a food ingredient. There are a lot of problems, or challenges, I should say, around the supply chain for cultivated seaweed. Much of the biomass that's used for the extraction of alginate now, it all comes from wild harvest seaweed, and the plants would be of a certain size and age, and you don't necessarily get the right sort of alginate developing in aquaculture plants, because they don't grow for more than a year. So they're less than a year old when they're harvested in general. But what I wanted to show you here is that alginate has film forming and gelling properties. And the second photo here is actually a picture of a face mask that's been made with saccharina. And that was, again, as part of a biorefinery project. We extracted the alginate from the saccharina and used it to make a face mask. We've also used the alginate component from Saccharina to make films. And I'm sorry about the quality of this, but it's the best photo I had. And I'm hoping that you can see the final photo here. This is a film that's made with extracted alginate. And both of the last two photos I've shown here are both attempts to make vegan sausage casings. And alginate is actually used to make vegan sausage casings. So we thought, if you can use alginate, why not use the alginate that's extracted straight from a biorefinery? So the picture on the right is actually from alginate that's been extracted and it's been purified. So typical food ingredient with no color, no odor. Whereas the image on the left of the film there, it's a minimally processed alginate product. But when it's used as a sausage casing, it's absolutely fine. You can't see it, and it has no taste or flavor. But taking a leap from making sausage casings, I hope you can see that there is a lot of potential actually for the development of bioplastics and biopackaging from the alginate component in seaweeds. And this photo was lent to me by Oceanium, which they're a company based in Scotland. They are developing a seaweed biorefinery concept based on aquacultured seaweed. And one of the end products that they're focusing on is actually bioplastics. So these are biodegradable plastics that have been produced from seaweed. And I thought I'd just focus a little bit more on bioplastics, because it's a hot topic for the industry and for the environment in general. And it's something I know that Coastwise is interested in. But just a few definitions on bioplastics, because it's a bit of a tricky area. You can have bio-based plastics. So these are made from bioresources, and they don't necessarily have to be all bioresources. They just have to be partly bioresources, and they don't have to be biodegradable. Then you have biodegradable plastics, which can be broken down by microorganisms, but they may or may not be bio-based. So biodegradable plastics are not necessarily bio-based. And within the bio-based plastic subcategory, you have two different categories really. The drop-in products, which these are products that have the same chemical structure, the same properties as the fossil-based counterparts. And they may or may not be bio-based, and they're bio-based and they're recyclable, And then you've got new products, which are totally different. And this is where the seaweeds fit in. And they're designed to be biodegradable. And I love this photo because it shows what's possible. And I don't know if you remember back to one of the London marathons several years ago, where they were giving out Lucozade in little seaweed pods. Well, this is the company called No PLA. They're a British company, and they're producing these seaweed-based pods. And if you look carefully in the photo here, you can probably pick out there's some tomato ketchup and brown sauce in some sachets there. There's some water. And also they produced a range of whiskies, and it's possibly some of the photos in the bottom here, which they were selling to the Asian markets. But I just wanted to give a few figures here about the bioplastic market, because it's huge. The global market in 2017 was about 7.8 billion tons of bioplastic, about 13 billion pounds in value. And this was estimated to grow to 30 billion. So now in 2021, we're probably approaching that. And just to see where the breakdown of the different plastics fit. So you've got 60 to 40%, the non-biodegradable versus the biodegradable products, and 20 to 80% in terms of like rigid forms and flexible products. And that gives you a little bit of indication of where the seaweed bioplastics might fit. And there's still some challenges, because obviously you have to create a barrier function. So in this instance, you have to keep the liquids in, and you have to keep the air out if it's food packaging. And if you're going for biodegradable products, then obviously they need to be broken down relatively easily, but then you don't want that to impact on the sort of structural integrity of the plastic itself. So there are quite a few companies now that are producing bioplastics based on seaweed. And a couple of examples here just to show what is possible. And another exciting area where alginate is being used is in 3D printing and in bioinks. And this photo, it's lovely. It's a picture of a wound patch. And I don't know, you may be aware that alginate and mannitol have historically been used in wound dressings. They have a number of properties which help with sort of drawing out the fluid surrounding a wound, and they promote wound healing. And this is the next generation really of wound dressings, and it's a 3D printed patch. This particular patch is made entirely of marine ingredients, so it contains marine derived alginate, marine derived cellulose, and also a number of different marine bioactives which may or may not be from seaweed. And it's not a very clear photo, but hopefully you can see here how it's used in, it's produced, sorry, through 3D printing. I just want to talk briefly about fluorotannins. Now, fluorotannins are antioxidants, and you only find them in brown seaweeds. They're not found in very high quantities in kelp species. They're far more abundant in species of, say, fucus and ascophyllum, things like that. But they are produced by the seaweed as natural grazer deterrents. They also have some sunblock properties. And there's a bit of research going on now looking at the potential to use these natural products as anti-fouling organisms. So the photograph that you see here, they're looking at the use of different marine extracts, some of which are fluorotannins, to prevent fouling on marine structures. And from our perspective, they're pretty useful. The photograph here on the left is just of some supplements. I just wanted to use it to illustrate this as one of the key markets now for seaweed bioactives is in human supplements. And weight management is a key and growing market. Many seaweed-derived extracts are actually focused at the weight management market. And that's because polyphenols have a really interesting effect on the enzymes that break down fats and sugars. So they block the enzymes that break down fats and sugars in the body. So that means you don't ingest, so you don't digest them, you just they pass through it and you excrete them. The photograph in the middle is the lovely chap that I encountered in Scotland, munching away on seaweed. And the enzyme blocking activity of polyphenols is actually being investigated now in terms of methane production in cattle. Now, I've put burping cows here, but it's obviously, it's both ends of the cow that we're worried about. I just didn't want to mention that so close to breakfast. But in the same way that the polyphenols block the enzymes that are responsible for breaking down fats and sugars in humans, they're also responsible for blocking the enzymes that cause methane production in cows. And if we jump over to the photo on the right here, some of you might recognize this as Asparagopsis. Now, this is the invasive species that we find around, the coast of mainly South Devon here. But there's been a lot of research carried out in Australia in particular on a different species of Asparagopsis. And they've actually shown that by including even 1 to 2% of Asparagopsis in the diet of cattle, you can cut the methane production by 90-odd%, and that's quite staggering. So because Asparagopsis is obviously invasive, there are issues with the cultivation of it in Europe. I mean, it is cultivated, it's very strictly controlled, but the focus for the European industry is more towards the use of polyphenols to block methanogenesis in cattle. Now, it's not as effective as the Asparagopsis, but there's still significant reduction in methane produced. I want to talk about protein. Protein is actually very important, and seaweed is a very good source of protein. The brown seaweed is normally about sort of up to about 20% protein, but it can be much, much higher in the reds and the greens. Those of you that eat your laver, then laver can be as high as 30 to 40% protein. So in terms of its nutritional profile, it's actually similar to some of the legumes. And seaweed protein is complete at some time of the year. And When I say complete, not all proteins are equal. They're all composed of different amino acids. And we need nine amino acids, essential amino acids that we can't synthesize in our own bodies. We have to take those in through our diet. And all of these 9 essential amino acids are present in seaweed at some times of the year. Now, if you remember back to the table at the very beginning, there's a huge variation in the sort of content of protein, but at some times of the year, then seaweed-derived proteins are actually considered to be complete. So they have the same or a similar nutritional profile to, let's say, some of the animal-derived proteins that we would eat. They've also got high levels of glutamate, and it's glutamate, you've probably heard of monosodium glutamate, which was originally extracted from seaweed, but that's what gives seaweed its sort of nice, tasty umami flavors. And the protein content of seaweed has been a key focus for the development of aquatic feeds and land-based feeds. And I want to introduce the concept of the protein transition to you now, because I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but the world in general, Europe very particularly, is in the middle of a protein transition. Now, this is a shift away from our traditional consumption patterns and production systems for a diet that's heavily based on animal-derived proteins. And it's moving towards the use of more sort of planet-friendly, healthy and nutritious proteins from different sources. A lot of plant-derived sources, but also new resources such as insects, fermented proteins. Some of you may already be eating things like corn, some of the fungal protein, but also seaweed protein, microalgal protein, and even things like duckweed, pondweed, lemna, because the most abundant protein on the planet is actually the rubisco protein, which is part of the chlorophyll and the photosynthesis apparatus in green plants. So all green plants contain protein. And it's interesting because there's a lot of research going on now to extract the protein from some of the green parts of our crops. So let's say we harvest the carrots go off to be used as carrots, and the carrot tops are sent to the protein extraction facility. I just want to introduce some of the reasons or drivers for this protein transition. So protein is the most environmentally costly nutrient for us to produce. And if you think about it, we're actually doing the agriculture bit twice, because we're producing the plant crops such as soya or whatever to feed to the animals. So it's being put through the system twice. And it's not really a very effective system, because there's actually a poor conversion rate of plant protein to animal protein. It's only sort of in the range of 10 to 40%. So there's a big argument to say, why are we bothering to put this plant protein through animals to generate protein? Why don't we just eat the plant protein itself? We know that more food is needed for our growing population, but what is more important is actually that the protein that we're producing on the planet at the moment, it's not distributed equitably. So there is an inequability of protein around the globe, and this is due to massive overconsumption in westernized countries, including Europe. We're a net importer of protein, so we're importing protein from outside of Europe, both for our own consumption and for our animals. And what is really frustrating is that we're wasting about 17 million tons of protein per year. And that's totally unacceptable, really, when there's a deficiency in food in other parts of the world. So we need more diversity. We need to make our protein supply chain more resilient. And by introducing different types of protein, then hopefully we can do this. And of course, consumers now are becoming more aware, they're becoming more conscious, and there are a number of sort of ethical beliefs such as animal welfare, health, and also concern for the environment that is driving this conversion away from eating animal protein towards eating different proteins. So I think we've established that there's certainly a case for the value of seaweed, and in processing seaweed to get the maximum value out of the biomass. But when you're developing an industry that's based on a resource, then you have to consider other factors such as the market demand and the supply. So it's all well and good to say that we can produce this, this fantastic extract that has all kinds of different impacts, but is there a market for that? That's one of the big questions. And another question is, if we're going to take something out of the seaweed that maybe comprises only 2% of the bulk of that seaweed, what are we going to do with the other 98%? So if we have demand for, let's say, 10 tons of a particular extract, we need to be aware that the rest of the biomass can actually be processed in a sustainable and resource efficient way, and that there are markets for it. And the diagram that I'm showing you here, it's a typical value pyramid for any resource really. And at the bottom of the triangle, sorry, that's jumped there. At the bottom of the triangle, then that represents the markets that are based on sort of bulk products, low value, high volume, and they would be things such as the minimally processed ingredients for food, feed, and horticulture. And as you move up the triangle, the value of the products increase, so there's more processing involved. You might be purifying extracts, moving towards markets such as cosmetics or nutraceuticals. And then right at the very top of the pyramid, you've got the very expensive, the high value extracts. But as you move up that pyramid, then obviously the market reduces, the required volume reduces. But if we're going to tackle some of the key end markets, such as the bioplastics and the biofuel industry, then the industry's come, biofuel and bioplastics, then the industry's come to realize that we need to actually extend this value pyramid down, and that the base products that we're producing at the moment even those are too expensive relative to what we need to do to be able to supply biomass for these larger markets. And if I just give you an example here of the value of some of the products that we currently have. So let's say animal feed, seaweed that's sold into animal feed or horticulture, roughly about £500 per dry tonne. Then as you move up the pyramid into some of these more expensive markets, then you'd be looking to get, thousands of pounds per dry tonne, depending on the final product. And then when you look at the products that might be used in pharma, let's say, then you're talking about thousands of pounds per kilo. So there's quite a jump there in the value. If we're going to be making products such as biofuels and plastic out of seaweed, then it's estimated that we can actually make an alginate-based plastic bottle for about £0.01. And if we're going to do that, then the value of our raw biomass needs to come down considerably. And at the moment, the price of wild harvested seaweed ranges from about £25 to £50 per wet tonne. Cultivated biomass is much higher, so it can be between 100 and £1,000 per wet tonne. And obviously, if you're paying that amount of money for your biomass, there's no way that you can produce a plastic bottle for £0.01. So let's have a look at the supply chain and let's see where all this seaweed is, where it's going to come from. Well, aquaculture, basically. At the moment, about 95% of the global seaweed crop comes from cultivated seaweed. Now, most of this activity is in Southeast Asia and around the tropics, but on average, the globe produces about 30 million wet tons of seaweed a year. The situation in Europe is much, much smaller, and currently aquaculture in Europe only is in the range of a few hundred tons, wet tons. Now this varies significantly. It largely depends on how many research projects are going on and whether there's a requirement for a lot more seaweed biomass. But the hope is that in the next few years that an average seaweed farmer at the moment might be producing tens of wet tons of seaweed, but that is going to be ramped up to hundreds of tons of wet seaweed and progressively up to thousands of tons of wet seaweed. Just wanted to show you a few photographs. I'm not going to cover the aquaculture story in any detail, but the photo here on the left-hand side is a photo of a rope. Typically, the brown seaweeds are grown on ropes, and if you can see, there's actually a twine that's twined around that rope. And what happens is that there are hatcheries where the seaweed spores are settled onto these twines. They're then wrapped around the ropes, and the ropes are put out into the ocean to grow. And some lovely photographs here from a company called At Sea Nova, and they are a spin-out company from a European project that was set up to look at innovative and more efficient ways to cultivate seaweed. And the picture in the middle here is actually of a sheet. It's covered in sugar kelp, which is quite amazing. And you can see it there on the right-hand side hanging down. And just to see what one of the at-sea farms looks like underwater, this is actually a mesh of like a fabric mesh, which is covered again in sugar kelp. Why are we going to have to aquaculture this biomass? Well, at the moment, the European seaweed industry is largely based on the harvest of wild stocks. And this is what the harvest of wild stocks looks like. Harvesting of kelp species, in particular for the for the alginate industry, it's big business in places like Norway, France, and Iceland. And this is how they harvest the biomass. So you can see that they use a rake or something similar, which is dragged along the bottom, and it basically rips out the seaweed. Now, at the moment, this is it's highly controlled, it's regulated, and at the moment, the amount of biomass that's being removed in this way is considered to be sustainable. But this wouldn't be sustainable if we're going to ramp up the seaweed industry, and if we require more biomass for our seaweed bioeconomy, then this is not a sustainable way forward. And actually, the mechanical harvesting of kelps is not permitted in the UK, and it's not permitted in Ireland. Just to show you what would happen if you rip out these fantastic seaweeds, you can see the amount of biodiversity that's associated with the holdfast and with the stipe of a typical, this is Laminaria hyperborea. And if you imagine, I mean, the photograph here shows you that a stipe has been cut off. If you rip the seaweed out, obviously you're going to kill it. And if you cut the stipes off at this level, you're going to kill it, because the growth of the kelp happens up in the blade, at the sort of base of the blade. That's where all the growth happens. So if you harvest above that growth zone, then in theory, the kelp can regenerate. But in this way, the kelp is ripped out and it's gone. There is some mechanical harvesting which is sustainable, and it is permitted in the UK. And this is mechanical harvesting of ascophyllum. Now it's very different, because in fact, actually the ascophyllum is just getting a haircut. It's harvested at high tide, so that the seaweed is floating up in the water column. And this is an adapted weed cutter from, I think, from Florida. So it just goes along and trims off the top 20 centimeters or so of the ascophyllum. And then by rotating the areas on which these companies harvest, then it allows the ascophyllum to grow back. So it's a sustainable resource. And I just want to mention very briefly green tides. I mean, Kat is going to talk to us about this in a couple of weeks' time, but there are instances where the removal of wild biomass might be acceptable. Green tides is one of those, because actually they can build up to such an extent that they become a nuisance. And also, I thought I'd put in a nice photograph with some sunshine. This is a particular problem in the Caribbean at the moment, because there are millions of tons of sargassum washing up on the beaches. And if you remember back to a talk we had from Sam Hallam a few weeks ago about weather patterns, then you probably remember that there are this massive circulating ocean currents between the coast of East Africa over to the Caribbean, and then up the coast of the Atlantic. And these currents are circulating these massive rafts of free-floating sargassum, which eventually is washing up on the beaches of the Caribbean. You can imagine this is not doing much for their tourism industry, because you wouldn't really want to be swimming in this or sitting on the beach. But there are a number of companies now, including C Combinator, who've given me these photos to use, and they are harvesting this seaweed, they're removing it, and they're using it in a biorefinery style process to make biostimulants and fertilizers. Now, at the moment, it's estimated that there are millions of tons, and I've even heard gigatons bandied around. I'm not entirely sure I know what a gigaton is, but I think that equals lots and lots of seaweed. So you can see in this case that harvesting of the wild stocks here would actually be a sustainable way forward. And as it is, this weed is totally blanketing coastal environments and causing problems. And that brings me on nicely to the big dream really for Europe is to establish these offshore multi-use farms. Now, much of the North Sea is zoned up for the for wind farms, and there are massive areas now of the North Sea along the Dutch, Belgian, German coast and up into the Baltic, which have been allocated for wind farms. And most of those coastal countries have stipulated that if the infrastructure for the wind farms is going in, then that infrastructure must also be used for other things. And aquaculture is a natural industry to pair with the wind farms. So this is an infographic that's been put together by a group called the North Sea Farmers. And they're very, very active in promoting a seaweed bioeconomy for Europe. You can see here that there are aquaculture lines put in between the wind farms for seaweed. There will also be things like mussels underneath. So it's truly going to be a multi-use farm. And the estimate is that even if 10% of the zone that is allocated for wind farms is actually used to produce seaweed, then we could actually produce 16 million wet tons of seaweed. And that's about half of the global seaweed crop at the moment, which is staggering. And also a huge benefit from this is that the seaweed would take up about 4.8 million tons of carbon dioxide and obviously generate lots of jobs. Now, seaweeds photosynthesize, as you know, so they take in carbon dioxide and they give out oxygen. So by having these massive seaweed farms off the coast of Europe, then we can actually be doing something really positive towards a climate emergency. So just to have a look now really at what would a potential biorefinery setup be. So the two basic approaches really to utilising biomass, seaweed biomass in a biorefinery style approach. The first is fairly simple, and this is the sort of model that's mostly been used at the moment on small scale to demonstrate the concept. And that's a cascading or a sequential extraction of all the high value products. So you basically start off with your whole seaweed biomass. You might chop it or dewater it just to make it easier to handle. And then you go through a series of different extractions to pull out some of the things that I've talked about, maybe the laminarin, the mannitol. Those extracts would then be purified in some way, recovered, and you'd end up with lots of different extract streams and probably a depleted solid residue which would contain the alginate. Just so that you can visualize this a little bit better, you might start off with some dried seaweed or some wet seaweed. And obviously wet seaweed is better because if you're going to dry the seaweed, then that's using energy. And if we can cut out all unnecessary use of energy, that's better. It does cause problems, obviously, because it means your processing has to be located very close to the resource because fresh seaweed doesn't transport very well. We'd load all of that seaweed into a big tank. Now, this is a typical tank that we would use to process seaweed. So it's heated, so you can control the temperature. It's got a stirrer in there. And this photo was taken during one of our projects where we were processing hundreds of tons of seaweed in a biorefinery style process. We then would go through a series of extractions. So we might play with the temperature, add some acids or maybe add some alkalis, so play around with the pH, whatever we need to do to extract the particular component that we're looking at. We might drain off that extract and then change the processing conditions. So put in some, more water at a different pH, change the temperature, get out another extract stream. Those extracts can then be filtered, and hopefully you can see here, this is a seaweed extract that's going through a clarifier. So on the left-hand side here, it's quite a cloudy extract, but it goes through the clarifier to remove some of the larger particulate matter. And then most likely the extracts will go through some kind of ultrafiltration or some membrane separation to clean them up and separate them out into some nice extracts. And this is an extract of fucoidin that we made in the lab. And then we end up with our alginate extract at the end, which could then feed into biopackaging or something like that. The second approach for a biorefinery is which you need to use if you're going to be looking at things like some of the biopackaging and also the biofuels. You need to totally break the seaweed down in the first place. So that's usually done using enzymes, and it might be done using thermal or chemical methods, but you bash it up into its component sugars, which can then be converted into the chemicals or biofuels, whatever it is that the end product is. This is a bit of a complicated diagram, but I just wanted to show you that you can integrate these approaches, and in fact you might want to take out a few high value product streams first, and then maybe bash up that residue and use that to produce ethanol. So it's a very flexible approach, and it really depends on the raw material that's feeding into the system, what products you want to get out of it, and also what technology is available. So what can you piece together to get the most out of your seaweed biomass? I'm afraid I don't have any pictures of any biorefineries to show you, but they're not big sort of ugly factories that are belching smoke and fumes. Most of them are actually now housed inside food processing plants. There's a lot of high-grade stainless steel appliances, a lot of filtration equipment. But I've just listed here some of the key European projects that are recent or are ongoing where a biorefinery approach has been taken. And I can send you the links if you're interested. You can have a look more at some of the equipment and facilities that are being used. And just to plug the most recent project that we've just started, this is the Minerva project. And we're also going to be taking a biorefinery approach now to look at some of the seaweed resources in Europe that are currently underutilized or undervalued, with a group of partners in Ireland, Sweden, and Iceland. And we're going to be looking at the valorization of different product streams in cosmetics, food, in aquaculture, so the photo I showed earlier of the anti-fouling plates, and also in the use of some of these products in wound healing, like the alginate patches that I showed you earlier on. So just to now have a look to see whether we can actually build this industry, which is going to go beyond being responsible to actually being restorative. And I think any bioeconomy that's based on those principles, we have to start thinking about giving something back. We can't just keep exploiting from our oceans. So the collective vision really for the European seaweed industry going forward, and I think this mirrors what's going on globally, is that this will be an upscaled, responsible and restorative industry. It's going to have to tackle some of the sustainable development goals that are in place, and these are the targets that are set out by United Nations for basically for us to generate a better planet and a better environment for everyone to live in. The industry is going to have to contribute to key issues such as food and nutrition security, also climate change mitigation, and poverty alleviation as well. These are all key global sustainable development goals. And also it's vital that we support the marine ecosystem and the services that they provide. So just to look at a number of the sort of key social impacts that a seaweed bioeconomy could actually have an impact on, and that's the development of new food chains. Well, I mean, we are we're pretty well behind Europe really in our acceptance of seaweed as a food directly. But I hope I've shown you today that we can develop some new ingredients, put those into our food supply chain. And obviously any new food supply chain is going to generate industry, it's going to generate jobs. And hopefully we can use this to rebuild some coastal, resilience into our coastal economies. I mean, a lot of our coastal economies are failing, and hopefully this could be a boost to bring them back. Obviously, the seaweed can contribute to the food nutrition and security, and I've already measured the protein transition. And in aquaculturing, the biomass that we need for this industry, then we can mitigate some of the overuse of terrestrial resources, and hopefully mitigate the land change use as well. And I just want to mention carbon capture and storage, because this really is one of the hot topics now that's driving the industry forward. As I mentioned, seaweed, they photosynthesize, so they naturally take in CO2 and they spit out oxygen, which is great. And we know that macro and microalgae are major contributors to the global oxygen. They're also naturally at sinking carbon. So it's estimated that marine algae and plants can store up to about 70% of our global carbon. So they take in this carbon dioxide and then they die. The photograph that you see at the bottom here is very typical of some of our beaches. I mean, you'd see this level of seaweed biomass washed up, say at Lee Bay, times of the year. This seaweed then, it breaks down, and the carbon then goes back into our carbon cycle naturally, gets washed out to sea, and is buried in certain environments. And farm seaweed is actually estimated to absorb anything in the range of about 15 to 60 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So it's considerable uptake of carbon and considerable sequestration that we could achieve by ramping up our seaweed aquaculture sector. And obviously, because the whole process is aimed at being environmentally responsible and sustainable, not generating excess effluents and waste streams, and cutting back on our energy consumption, then in general, carbon mitigation would be achievable using this kind of approach. And I just wanted to mention a company down in South Devon, Green Ocean Farming, because they're tackling carbon sequestration head on. This company, it's more of like it's a one-stop shop really for aquaculture. So if you're interested in owning a seaweed farm or investing in a seaweed farm, then this company would be a company to contact. So they deal with everything really from the applications, identifying suitable sites for aquaculture, to actually implementing the seaweed farm and then managing it for you if you want to. And you can actually invest in this company now. You can donate money towards carbon sequestering. And when I talked to Alec at Green Ocean this week, he said it's an area that's really taken off, and that people are interested in not only growing seaweed in a farm to utilize the end products, but also in just establishing seaweed farms, kelp forests for their carbon sequestration, and letting them go through the cycle naturally of growing and dying. And finally, if we're going to be introducing massive scale kelp farming, then what can this do for our ecosystem services? Well, mitigation of climate change we've already talked about, but there's a growing body of evidence to show that that large scale farming of kelps will support biodiversity. Obviously, it's going to provide habitat and boost our food webs. Now, just because we're growing lots of seaweed, it doesn't mean it will all be harvested in any one particular year. So there will be a lot of biomass around for natural cycling as well. The organic carbon from seaweeds, as I've mentioned, it's fundamental to the basis of our marine food web. So the more we can be putting back into the food web, the better. Seaweeds are also known to be good bioremediators, so they remove dissolved nutrients and pollutants from the water column, and hopefully Kat will talk to us a bit more about this in a few weeks' time. And they're also vital for our coastal defences, and this is one of the reasons why mechanical harvesting is not permitted in the UK, because kelp forests actually form a buffer against wave energy. So I think I'll leave it there for now, just to point out that there are other valuable things that you can get in seaweed. It's surprising what you might find if you're delving around in the seaweed. So thank you.